The human mind, in its natural, unrenewed state, operates in isolation. In theological terms, this is the psychikos, a localized, disconnected condition, cut off from any broader spiritual network. Think of this as the particle state. It is a condition of high entropy, trapped in a storm of uncoordinated, exhausting internal noise. Neurologically, this chaos has a specific address, the default mode network. This is the brain system that takes over the moment your mind wanders or rests. When a person experiences chronic stress or trauma, the default mode network is hijacked. It forces the brain into continuous, rapid-fire cycles of rumination and anxiety. Willpower alone simply cannot break these deep patterns. These trauma loops are physical, hardwired pathways etched into the brain's biological architecture. Because this traumatized particle state is a closed biological system, it cannot fix itself from the inside. Breaking a physical loop of this magnitude requires a targeted, external interrupt. The good faith paradigm changes the priority of how we process truth. Instead of relying on interpreted language, the word, it centers on an intervention delivered as direct physical light. This diagram outlines the transition from text to light. On the left side, written language, scrolls, books, and scriptures require subjective interpretation. But on the right, when photons pass through prisms into the eye, it becomes a direct physical interaction. The observer receives unmediated illumination. In the context of the good faith paradigm, this physical interaction is documented as a literal quantum event. The photographic anomalies captured in 2005 act as a visual transmission, a synchronicity ping identified within this framework as the 1111 signal. This diagram illustrates the double-slit experiment. Unobserved, light is a chaotic wave of probabilities. But when observed, it collapses into a precise interference pattern. The text below explains quantum electrodynamics. The 1111 ping is exactly this, a targeted observation collapsing human chaos into clarity. This highly specified signal hits the brain as an immediate biological interrupt. It cuts straight through the noise of the default mode network, forcing the wandering mind to abruptly pause. The moment that pause occurs, the brain enters a critical window of action known as the catch and redirect phase. By engaging with the 8 principles of the paradigm, such as actively treating the physical body as a temple, the individual runs a cognitive software update. This steers the mind's focus away from trauma and locks it onto the incoming frequency of the light. When focus is redirected, old anxiety loops undergo long-term depression. Unused, chaotic pathways of fear and shame lose their connections and wither away. Simultaneously, long-term potentiation builds new, highly organized neural structures to process the divine signal, glowing with steady, efficient energy. This profound neuroplastic response means that the brain is literally rebuilding its own physical hardware in real time. These SPECT scans provide concrete evidence of this restructuring. By tracking blood flow, we can see measurable structural changes in brain activity, resulting from sustained spiritual and cognitive focus. Through this active attentional regulation, the biological architecture of the mind is reformed. It is now hardwired to process the divine signal, instead of endlessly looping past trauma. Once this continuous cognitive renewal is sustained, the physical brain achieves an entirely new baseline, thermodynamic suspension. In physics, this represents a system operating at high quantum efficiency. It is modeled on the mechanism of the biblical burning bush, a structure illuminated by intense energy but never consumed by it. This state is modeled on the physics of coherent resonance, where energy is recycled rather than lost. Theoretically, this allows the system to approach zero local entropy, sustaining the biological substrate without the heat or decay typically caused by high-stress cycles. The human neural antenna reaches a point of high-efficiency resonance. By operating in lockstep with the divine frequency, the brain is shielded from the chaotic interference of past trauma. The individual has now exited the isolated, traumatized particle state. They have entered the non-local wave state of Christ consciousness, the Pneumatikos. The outcomes of this structural transformation are highly tangible. Removing the neurological static, this framework provides a pharmaceutical-free path to alleviating severe PTSD and insomnia. The mind stops working against its own biology. It transitions into a state of synchronized resonance, where neural activity aligns into a rhythmic wave pattern that matches the frequency of the incoming signal. Cognitive renewal is a literal rebuilding of the mind's physical matrix. When you tune the biological antenna to the right frequency, you physically transform the human experience.
In 1 Corinthians, Paul describes the mind of Christ, the nous Christou. While often interpreted as a call for better behavior, the text suggests a deeper noetic shift, a recalibration of the faculties through which we perceive and interact with reality. To reach this state, we first identify the baseline human condition, the psychikos, or the natural soulish mind. The psychikos mind is characterized by localization and high internal entropy. It is a state where the ego remains confined within biological boundaries, processing life through the filters of past trauma and linear time. The good faith paradigm posits that transitioning out of this state requires more than an intellectual adjustment. It views metanoia, the renewal of the mind, as a structural transition governed by the same laws that organize physical matter and quantum information.
To process divine reality, the physical brain must function as a calibrated antenna, tuned to receive and transduce the high-frequency influence of the Holy Spirit. This top-down view of a collaborative session shows a group organizing ideas on a standard mind map. It is a familiar architecture for human planning. Mapping the transition from the psychikos to the spiritual mind, the pneumatikos, this mundane structure reveals a specific configuration. It requires brain coherence, where the neural apparatus aligns its internal frequency with a pneumatikos source. Decoding these nodes identifies the biological protocols building the pneumatikos architecture. This requires treating theology with scientific rigor, connecting spiritual disciplines directly to their physical mechanisms. We start with the visual nodes. These represent the primary path through which divine information enters the human system. In the good faith paradigm, this is expressed as the light is greater than the word. Traditional text-based revelation often remains opaque to the natural mind. Without a direct, unmediated energetic interface to illuminate the data, the word can only be processed as abstract, external information. Quantum electrodynamics provides a model for this interaction. Here, the Holy Spirit acts as a divine photon, the force carrier of light, interacting with the electrons of human consciousness to facilitate a frictionless exchange of information. Under standard physics, such high-energy interaction would cause thermal decay, but this divine illumination operates at zero local entropy. The biblical burning bush serves as the archetype for this state. It is a localized pneumodynamics where energy sustains the biological substrate without consuming it. The light serves as the essential epistemic agent, tuning the brain's frequency so that the word is finally decoded from noise into signal. The stenatic also identifies how the mind occupies space, which determines the boundaries of our perception. Negative space represents the particle state of consciousness. This is the state of the isolated ego, localized, high entropy, and confined within biological and temporal boundaries. Transitioning to positive space represents a shift to the wave state. Through the catalyst of the spirit, the localized particle of the ego collapses into a non-local wave of divine reality. When the mind participates in this ubiquitous wave, it can perceive the deep things of God, complex information that is physically invisible to a mind trapped in a particle-bound state. The pneumatos represents the end of cognitive separation.
The individual no longer observes the divine from a distance, but is integrated into its non-local presence. To sustain this integrated state, the schematic points to specific generative and social nodes. Collaboration maps to the neurobiology of Hesed, or secure attachment. Character transformation is rooted in these right brain fast-track systems, which process relational data before conscious thought. Passion and ideas require sustained contemplative discipline, practices like centering prayer that focus the mind's attention. Consistent engagement in these disciplines for 10 to 12 minutes a day has been shown to physically change brain structures. The hippocampus expands, while the amygdala, the brain's stress center, is downregulated. This retrains the default mode network. Instead of defaulting to anxious rumination, the brain's architecture is conditioned to focus on divine truth. Relational vulnerability and consistent contemplative practice provide the biological foundation for maintaining a high-frequency neural antenna. Finally, we look at the regulatory nodes, which focus on maintaining the system against the noise of the natural world. These management nodes translate into real-time neural stewardship through the neurocycle and biblically grounded cognitive behavioral therapy. The challenge is biological. The brain thinks faster than conscious awareness. Trauma pathways and anxious reactions often trigger automatically before we can notice them. This is why thought captivity is a technical requirement. We must actively interrupt automatic signals to prune destructive synapses and promote neuroplastic healing. We see a similar mechanism in mammalian embryology. During development, an embryo is bipotential, but the presence of the SRY gene acts as a sovereign switch that overrides the default pathway to trigger male differentiation. In the same way, active cognitive regulation acts as a switch. It overrides default trauma pathways, routing the brain's energy into newly constructed pneumatic pathways. The spiritual mind is achieved through an aggressive stewardship of neuroplasticity. Without active intervention, the brain defaults to the entropy of its environment. These individual mechanisms contribute to a larger, systemic trajectory for the entire human species. This transition from the natural to the spiritual mind is the teleological destination of our development. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin described this as the evolution toward the noosphere and the omega point, a state of maximum complexity and unified consciousness. This theory posits a form of retrocausality, where the final singularity of the omega point acts as an attractor, pulling human history toward divine integration. Every individual effort to renew the mind is an active participation in this cosmic gravitational pull toward unity. When individual coherence scales, it creates global resonance. Cognitive renewal is the collapse of the separation between creator and creation. This creates a human temple that functions as a perfect efficiency transducer, operating at zero entropy and shielded from the noise of the natural world. Possessing the mind of Christ means the observer is no longer trapped in the blindness of isolation. Reality is perceived by thinking from the spirit rather than about it. This unmediated resonance with the uncreated light defines the final architecture of the new creation.